transform our space here at UWEC to be a more just institution. Please welcome Dr. Jennings. And Dr. Jennings, I'll have you take it from here.
All right, and Maggie, Poso, Mauniwiak, Nuiswin, Sasanehsaeh Jennings. So hello, my name is Sasanehsaeh Jennings, as you heard in the intro. I'm here just to have a conversation. I always like to start these off with, I'm not that I've thought about in my work surrounds. And so I know there are my other colleagues on this call I can see that have just as much insight and would offer to have dialogue, right? And if people have stopping my video because I have internet issues, but hopefully you can still hear me. Let me know if you can't. And so I am really just going to offer some conversation. Hopefully, I don't want to take too much of presentation time because I really want to have a conversation so we can really get this dialogue going. So see if I move it. Okay. Screen. Sorry, I think you lost me. But that's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah, again, so sorry about that. Bear with me, internet issues up here. Hopefully we can keep going. All right. Let me see if I can open this up. I think it says voting's closed. It shouldn't be closed, but that's all right. Maybe if we can just, what are some list of stereotypes or narratives you've heard or learned about Native people thus far? And I can check out the chat function too as well. Oh, actually, you can use it. I just opened up the feature. So if you go to wdi.com and use the code 4772, okay, 939. Okay, people are going, cool. Yep, we'll just take some time. Again, this doesn't mean that you know that you believe these stereotypes. It may maybe things that you've heard, maybe be things that people have told you. So feel free to add what you feel comfortable. It's anonymous, so too. So if you feel more comfortable putting in some of the maybe negative things you might have heard. So we got powwows, alcoholism, the savage alcohol, dress and feathers, addiction, gambling, smoke peyote, casino money. Any others that people can think about? Long hair, lazy, pre-modern, reliant on federal government for resources. Supported from the government. Traditional. Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Fishing and hunting rights, slow. hate the pop culture imagery in general, like Pocahontas. Yeah, a lot of connected to nature, resilient. So a lot of different things, right? A lot of different things I've learned or, heard other people talk about. So thank you for sharing those insights. And again, this is just things you may have worked this out, right? So I always like to gain insight of, what are those narratives? What are those things? And then why has it those narratives exist? I would argue because of colonialism, but that has also happened is current day. And so because language is super is it better? It was breaking up. Shoot. Well, I'll keep going. Please keep up. It's helpful. It's not better. Okay. And again, I apologize. This is been a pain for us here. How about that? Is that better? Is that better? Hear me? Can anybody? Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Again, I told Maggie that my internet is being shoddy. So again, I apologize for this disruption, but these are the times, right? So where we kind of left off is, colonialism. That's why I believe a lot of those narratives are placed there. And because language is super important to us, I feel like we need to be on kind of the same grounding and same standing of what colonization I'm referring to. And so and I also want to say there are tons of different definitions around colonization. And I like to use this one because it's from two Native scholars. And I think what it does is it encompasses a greater kind of comprehensive idea around colonization, including the behavioral, ideological, institutional, political, and economical. But the main part of it, and I think that we need to really focus on, is this idea of subjugating and exploiting indigenous peoples' lands and resources. In order for this United States to be United States, right, indigenous people had to be erased in multiple ways. One is actual genocide. Another was assimilation, acculturation, and by a certain tool, education. In the 19th and 20th centuries, and we'll get into that sooner. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, that's what education institutions were created for, was to assimilate and acculturate Native people. All right. So I just took this from last night. I thought it was super relevant, right? When the presidential information and election information was being broadcast across the United States, we weren't even a part of the conversation, right? This idea that we're something else, that we're still invisible. So very, very relevant, very current. It's nothing new, and it's super unfortunate, but something that, I was like, the settler colonial mentality exists. And here's an example of it. So I quickly put that in there because I thought it was very relevant to this conversation. So in education, just to really ground us in some statistics, this is from the National Center for Education Statistics and the educational attainment of young adults. So percentage of 25 to 29-year-olds with a bachelor's degree. And so I'd just like to show the statistics that, 14% and or 16% in 2000 and 2019, 14% of all of the population of Native people in the United States had a bachelor's degree, which, is on the low end compared to a lot of, our counterparts on this graph. And a lot of people would call that an achievement gap, right? And so Gloria Lansing Billings, she's retired now, but she was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She really tried to push us to think about this in a different way, where achievement gap really focuses on something that's an individual deficiency. It's really a historical, and it hides the racial inequality that exists. And so she was really pushing us to think about an education debt. And so we can really wrap our heads around what historically has happened to different groups and why there's this debt that has been created. It forces the accountability of mistreatment that happened, and also kind of focuses on the institution, right? It doesn't necessarily focus on the individual. And so, in a lot of work that I do, and just in general, I think it's really important. While I'm not a historian, I do think that we need to really look at history and to understand some of the things that are happening now. And so with this education debt, I would offer, it was created, one, because of colonialism, because education was a tool for social control. And it created this locked-in inequality. If you look at Gilborn, he talks about this idea that, in history, there may have been a historical disadvantage that was put on a particular group, and now it becomes so institutionalized into our institutions that if we took it away, or granted those advantages to people, that it would never level the playing field. And I think that's super important to think about, right? I think it's important to think about the foundations of our institutions, particularly higher education institutions, and what ways have we created institutions to be places where Native students can thrive in a particular way, for students in general to thrive in a particular way. And so just briefly, and this is super simplified, but I like to show that, in the history part, right? In the 19th and 20th century, the federal government and the government in general had a lot of citizenship and educational policies that were really meant for acculturation and assimilation for Native people, right? We talk about the boarding school era, we're talking about English only in schools. We're talking about Americanization, right? Accepting the ways of life of American people. And I argue that education tools were then used for this tool of social control, because in those days, students were taken away from their families, they were removed from their culture, they were wanting to assimilate, they were wanting the students to assimilate to the American life, or, the United States at the time. And really, that's part of the settler colonial project, right? Because again, the United States needed us to not be Native in order for them to gain access to the land that they wanted to bring wealth to. And so another three great Native scholars, but it's this idea that, you know, there was a creation of social change through education. And it's the where they want the Indian to become civilized, right? And they wanted to do this through education. And I argue that higher education continues to do that in particular ways. You know, this idea that we have to leave our communities, whether it be, you know, a suburban Native community, whether it be an urban Native community, whether it be a reservation community, we have to leave those communities in order to become educated, right? Or civilized, if you think about the boarding school kind of rhetoric. Also, this idea of assimilation, where, you know, a lot of our institutions are talking about this idea of diversity. But it's interesting, right? Because it's this idea of being a guest or an outsider to the institution, and that sometimes we're only welcomed on conditions that we assimilate or integrate into the campus culture, the campus life, that sort of thing. And so in order to do that or be successful in higher education, you know, my argument is that we continue to do the same things that we did in the 19th and 20th century. We're continuing to do those things to our Native students. We're removing them, we're assimilating them in order to be successful in higher ed. So I want to offer to you all, you know, what does success look like in higher education? What were things that have been told to you that in order to be successful in education, what are things that we have to do? So if you can, graduate school. It could be anything. It could be in the classroom, outside of the classroom, things that people have told you, and what if professors have told you, high GPA. Ability to deconstruct yourself, your environment, your circumstances, and use it to make the world a better place. Get a job, finish in 4 years, job right out of college, a major that leads to a real job, choose a major. Yeah. Engaged in campus life. Just pass the class. You need to know when you enter college what you want to do. Yep, that discernment. Those are all really good. Great. Pass standardized tests. Yeah, a plethora of different things, right? From classroom things to thinking about your life and why you came to a higher education, outside of classroom things, being an individual and self-dependent. Yeah, a plethora of different things. So thank you for participating in that. And so when I did my research, I did some focus groups with Native undergraduate students and Native graduate students. It was important for me to do graduate students, I thought, because they chose to go back, right? Just as I was a part of this kind of research, because I was doing my PhD at the time. And I thought it was interesting to see what their thoughts were, because, you know, again, they chose to go back to higher education in a particular way. And so what I was trying to ask them was, what does it mean to be a student and to do school? So how do you perform school, or what does that mean for you? And in their thoughts, they iterated that student success was based in this idea of white ideology. So I would say, you know, white supremacy, having to speak a certain way, having to behave a certain way, professionalism, really thinking about those colonization and colonialism effects on us. And in order to be successful, they felt like their culture was eroded, right? They had to be removed from their community and family. They didn't fit in, and they had a different worldview. That was very tough for them. So very, very similar, right, to these boarding schools in the 19th and 20th century. So to be a student in higher ed, what are some things that are expected of you? It could be, again, in the classroom, outside of the classroom. Get involved in student orgs, go to all classes, balance job and class, manage your time well. Yeah. What else? Talk to professors, balance, make new friends, and learn new things. What are some other things you can think of? Talk in class, yep, that's a big one. Or engage, whatever engage means to the instructor. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for that again. So one of the things that the students kind of was a strong iteration for me, or what they really talked about, is schools have expectations of how students should be. And then particularly this student was talking about how, you know, she felt like being a student and being Native, it was a dichotomy, right? She couldn't be one or the other. She felt like she had to participate in, when she was participating in school, that she couldn't be Native, she couldn't go home, she couldn't participate in a communal events. So it really was hard for her to continue to do her professional studies. She was actually a graduate student. So this idea of, you know, Native and being Native and a student weren't synonymous to each other. They also talked about this idea of navigating two different worlds, right? And so I really typically don't like to put a lot of words on a slide, but I thought it was important to not chop their quotes off. I really wanted you to get a sense of, you know, how they felt. And I like the first student. They talk about, you know, we have to go to these institutions because we need to survive in this world, but it goes really counter against who we are as Native people and just who they were in general, right? I think that's a really heavy and not necessarily groundbreaking idea, but to continue to keep hearing those things, I think it's something that we need to really think about. And then the bottom quote, this idea of it being a battle, right? Again, these two things are not synonymous. They're a dichotomy of things. So it's either being Native or being educated and participating in an institution. So now what? Again, you know, I don't think these are very groundbreaking things. I think these are things that have been going on for a long time, but I think institutions really need to think about how they are connecting with their Native students, particularly for, you know, acknowledging land. We're thinking about who is on our campus historically. And so, you know, beyond that, right, beyond these land acknowledgements, because these land acknowledgements are definitely trendy, but what does it mean past that? And so one of, again, some brilliant Native scholars had put together a policy brief, which is on the resources at the end of this presentation, but just some things to think about, that things we could be doing with our institution. So developing partnerships with Native nations, I think those are, and genuine partnerships at that, right? And, you know, in my current role as the tribal liaison of UW system, I think it's super important to create this consultation policy. I've told, you know, the president of the system that, you know, I can't do my job like I'm supposed to if there's not a particular policy in place, because what we really need to be doing is we really need to be honoring the sovereignty of these nations. First, locally in state, but ideally across the United States. And so hopefully right now what we've been doing is we've been meeting with all the tribal leadership, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, well, not post, but current pandemic. We've been doing some Zoom and phone calls. And so really just building these relationships and genuine relationships, which take a long time. It takes a long time to do that. And I also like to put up the MOU that the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, my brother and colleague David O'Connor has been working on. Another great partnership, and my thought is we have a system-wide consultation policy, but each campus like UW-Eau Claire can really work to develop their own MOUs and partnerships with the Native nations around you. Just what you did, honored connections to the place. I appreciate, opening up with a land acknowledgement. And so I think that's a really good step in knowing that history. So it'd be awesome if every UW-Eau Claire student knew what the ancestral lands were, where UW-Eau Claire sits. So I think that's great to have that as an acknowledgement, but how can we move forward in the curriculum and orientation programs and really get our students to acknowledge where we are and where we came from. So this one, it's critically examined data used to understand and not marginalize Native student experience. Basically, it's this idea of not always clumping Native people together. We come from a plethora of different tribal nations, people who are enrolled, descendants, people who come from suburban areas, urban areas, reservations, and we're not all homogeneous. We're all very different. We may have some generalities and similarities, but most times we're very different. And I think sometimes it's hard when institutions clump everybody together, because it really it doesn't allow us as community members to shine through and really represent who we are as for me, as a Menominee woman. So really, how can we do this in these institutions? How can we not clump all Natives together? I know, it'd be hard structurally to figure that out, but if we really want to develop a sense of belonging and a place for Native students to really thrive, this may be something to think about. And I think this one, you all are doing this series, so I think you get this one, but training faculty and staff to be culturally competent. There are tons of great resources, and this is just one that we have in the state, but also nationwide, really keeping the conversation going, right? that CNN side is just another reminder of how we need to keep these conversations going, and not just Native people, but for our fellow, diversity, equity, inclusion accomplices. How can we really push these ideas forward? How can we make an institution that's culturally competent? This is, I think, super important, is to empower students to maintain connections with their families and home communities. So these are another few quotes, and I know for me, personally, going off to school, I always had this kind of idea that, I have to support and do these things for my community. And that's how I continue to do my work now. But, it's hard when you're away. It's hard to know what your family and communities need when you're away. And so how can institutions really bring in the families and bring in communities on campus, or virtually? How can we bring them in as a part of the student process and as part of the student experience? I think that's really important, because then, right, students don't feel as removed from. So that's the gist of just the presentation. Again, I wanted this to be a dialogue. Here are some resources that help put this together. But again, I wanted this to be a dialogue really, start to talk about these notions, these ideas. Have my colleagues who are on this call or on this meeting to be able to chime into. So yeah, that's really the part of my formal presentation, but I want to open up for any questions that anybody may have.
And I just want to say, like, originally we planned to just put questions in the chat feature, but to really make this more of a dialogue, if we just use the chat feature to put your name in there to indicate that you would like to ask a question so that we can go through people, I think that would be better for the nature of this presentation. So if you'd like to ask a question, just indicate in the chat that you have a question, and then we'll just list your name off and you can just ask directly. Okay, so I think then I'll start with a question then, since people might be kind of thinking about what they would like to ask. I think as a coordinator in the Office of Multicultural Affairs, one of my primary responsibilities is reaching out to Native students on campus to try to help create a community within our university, which can be kind of challenging at times, especially given the pandemic and how things are just being virtual. But as you said, a lot of times their communities and their families come first, and they might see, even though it's coming from a Native coordinator in the Office of Multicultural Affairs, as a way of that being sort of an assimilation type of process, even though we're trying to create community among Native students. So what kind of recommendations do you really have for building community for students that may just want to have some support amongst themselves on campus?
Yeah, I think it's important to build genuine relationships, right? And I know, when I came to Oak Cliff in my tenure at System, and really visiting with those students and asking them, well, what do you really think? What are your experiences? Letting their voice be heard, but also, just trying to let them know that, some of the things that they're experiencing, everybody experiences. I think sometimes it can feel heavy, it can feel large. For example, if you're thinking about financial aid, right? Some tribes, not all, offer financial aid in a particular way, but some financial aid offices aren't trained to be able to take that and put it to students' accounts, or it's a little bit late. And so sometimes students feel like, they're lost. And so I think sometimes it's just really being a resource and just validating those experiences and how tough it can be, right? How tough it can be. But I think sometimes, as coordinators, we have the tough job to program for everybody, and that's hard. But I think if we can try to make personalized programs or communications, or just connect personally, I think that's really helpful. And also, being open and available to people's communities and families if they have questions.
All right. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, my co-presenter.
Dr. Jennings. Michael Thomas here. I'm one of the student services coordinators in the Office of Multicultural Affairs with my colleague Maggie. And I had a question. I really appreciate the presentation that you provided, and then really providing some background and research on settler colonialism. I find it to be a very interesting topic, and just really informs, I want to say, pedagogy, how we might consider infusing our students' experiences into the curriculum. I wanted to know, and this has been my experience. I'm not speaking for everyone, but I've been here for a number of years, and some of the feedback that I've had I've had the opportunity to listen to coming from faculty specifically in certain disciplines, right? Kind of how, I guess, difficult it is to imagine or expand upon the curriculum to be more inclusive of diverse voices. And in this case, we're talking about the Native student experience. So what are some recommendations, or I know you share some resources, but what are some recommendations you can provide for faculty to have them to, I guess, better, not only better understand what's available in terms of access, but also really content in terms of empowering and uplifting the student experience into curriculum?
Yeah, great question. I would say, there are tons of Native scholars across disciplines. And so even bringing in some of their work into their readings and their syllabi, we're not just located in American Indian Studies. We do, traditional ecological knowledge. So if you're thinking about, the sciences, if you're thinking about, English, if you're thinking about just history, there are tons of different and a number of great scholars who, bring in their work, bring in their point of view and their perspective. I think that's where it starts, right? Is incorporating those into our classrooms, beyond American Indian Studies. While I appreciate having American Indian Studies, and I think, I think my colleagues would agree that, we need to have support outside of that. Because we do exist outside of those realms. And I think that's important to really think about. And even if you're thinking about other identities, bringing in other perspectives that may be different. And it may require the faculty to education, lifelong learning is about.
Thank you so much for your answer. I appreciate it.
Does anybody else have any questions? Right. It looks like we do have another question here from Annika. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Annika.
Annika. Okay, sorry, Annika.
No, you're good. So I was wondering, are there any places or institutions that stand out as doing well in some of those goals that you were talking about towards the end? Or is it very much still work in progress pretty much everywhere?
I would say it's still a work in progress, right? I think some of the ones that stick out that are maybe doing some things a little bit better, but some other things not so much. There are a lot of First Nations institutions in Canada that are doing some really good work. The University of Saskatchewan is doing some really good work. Arizona State, they have their own, well, I don't know if they're border regions. So they have a tribal consultation policy across their system. Arizona State, I think, and the University of Arizona. And so that's a really good, practice. But I think as a whole, I think we need to do better with each of those different recommendations. And I think it'll look different in different contexts, right? I was speaking to a group in Clemson where there's probably not a lot of big Native communities locally. So that'll look different, right? That would look different. That engagement would look different. And so I think oftentimes, we look for those standard gold star institutions, but I think we really need to focus on our context and where we are located geographically, and, particularly for, what UW-Eau Claire can be really great at. I think, there are a number of institutions in the system that are doing some really great stuff. But again, I think it should be unique to the institution.
Thank you.
I think I have another question that I'd like to ask as well. Again, if anybody would like to ask a question, just indicate that in the chat, and then we'll have you ask your question. One question that I do have is, kind of talked about this too, that learning about Native people just doesn't live in American Indian studies. And we also find at a lot of institutions that the building relationships with tribes tends to kind of fall within the Office of Multicultural Affairs or American Indian Studies. Is there other departments within campuses that you feel should also be building relationships with tribes or other professionals on campus? And if so, maybe what departments?
Yeah, I think I'm working with institution in Wisconsin doing this very same thing. And I told them that it has to be a kind of down mentality. So I think your administration really the prime player in giving departments that need to be connected to different ways, and for folks who may not be familiar with tribal communities, particularly reservations, they're sovereign nations, and so education is one little sliver of what they deal with on a daily basis. And so oftentimes, when we're connecting with them, we forget that they're still looking to support their healthcare in a particular way. They're still looking to support their elders and their businesses in a particular way. And so really thinking about how you can look at and be a part of these different Native communities outside of that, right? Could we potentially be building internships and connecting students to their businesses? Could we be connecting, with the different professionals in these communities, and what do they look like? So I think it's all in every connection. I think it's important, but I think those relationships I can not stress enough that have to be genuine. It has to be genuine, and it may take a while to build those, but I think once they're built, it'll really benefit our students in a particular way. And in the long run, I think it'll benefit all those who come next. Hopefully my little one, I don't know what higher ed will look like, or our little ones will look like, but hopefully it'll benefit them when and if they choose to attend, a higher ed institution.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from participants? I guess I'll throw another one out there. Do you have any recommendations of changes that we can make to maybe physical spaces on campus for more representation, or helping kind of decolonizing physical spaces and make students feel more comfortable?
Yeah, I think in just reimagining, I'm actually teaching a social justice and higher ed class right now. And one of the things I'm trying to push my students to think about is, how can we reimagine higher ed differently, right? So I know we're in this time where we're in this, fortunate or unfortunate time, however you want to choose to see it, how we can reimagine what learning looks like. We're all on computers now. So what does that look like? Do our classroom spaces look different? I think even like the main, like the commons, what do those look like? I can't remember, but even, some of the DW systems are putting up some of the flags that represent the 12 nations in Wisconsin in their common area. So doing that, that's something to think about. I just think, also too, really getting outside, you getting outside, using the your campus environment in a way, right? And really honor that land that you say you all do. Really get to know it, and I think make it become personal for you all.
Great, thank you very much. And Michael, it looks like you have another question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, once again for the presentation and the information that you shared with us this evening. I'm just curious, and knowing your position within the UW system at the system level, I just wanted to ask you, like, what are three things, I guess, from a policy perspective that you would like to see change or legislated on behalf of underrepresented students and Native students in particular?
Great question. So the first one is the tribal consultation policy, right? I think that getting that into policy across system, where it would require all institutions to consult with Native nations when it's appropriate, right? When, you know, so for right now, for instance, I don't know if people have heard about UW Stevens Point and their burial site. Their campus is being trying to figure out what they're going to do with this native burial site that they found. And so that's huge, right? That's huge. And to not have these conversations without the Native nations present, I think are super important. And so they're working on that, and they're bringing in the Native nations, I think, very appropriately. And so that would be huge, huge. I think that would cover all three of them. This is a tribal consultation policy. But my second thing, I think, again, is it's just relationship building. I think, building particular MOUs with different community organizations, different communities, to have an understanding of how they want their students to be served. I think sometimes as institutions, we're very arrogant and we think we know best when it comes to education, but sometimes we need to ask these communities. And I think it's important to be in conversation and to build that relationship with our communities, whatever that may look like, and having, particular partnerships, having official partnerships, I think is important. 3, policy. Well, one thing that I think they've been doing or we're thinking about is just how can we look at our policy making and policies in general with the inclusive and equity lens. So who does it serve? Who is it for? Who does it privilege? Who does it not? So really thinking about our policies and how it affects marginalized and minoritized communities. I think those are all really important to think about.
Thank you so much for your answer with that. And it's really made me think about some of the work that we're doing here in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. Traditionally, we've had a multicultural student leadership retreat for a number of years, and we've recently reimagined it to be more social justice focused. And so focusing on the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color students' experiences. And one of the things that we incorporated into this leadership retreat is the idea of being in community and creating partnerships. And so it made me think about what your response made me think about with some of the literature on community university engagement and how a lot of the I want to say inconsistencies in trying to build those relationships stems from the university viewing community as kind of like passive recipients of help, as opposed to active participants in creating a shared vision for that process. So I really, really appreciated that because that resonated with a lot of the work that we're doing right now currently. So thank you so much.
And I'm willing to answer any questions, if you have questions about my journey or outside of the presentation, pretty much open book.
Yeah, anybody else have any questions? Okay, I guess if not, I think my last question would be more just related to how are things way up north right now? Are you experiencing some good weather?
Yeah, it's actually it's pretty nice out. It was like 60s or 70s yesterday. Actually haven't been outside today, dealing with the little tiny one and trying to work. It's a little hard to be outside, but it's going well. Things are well, as best they can be, right, during these times. So, but I appreciate you all having me come and connect with you all. Oh, it looks like we have one more question. I'm happy to answer.
Oh, great. Okay.
Hi, yeah. So just, I hope this isn't too long of a question, but do you think that integrating these changes into higher education then would be able to lead to greater change in society overall and infrastructure there, since so many young people are channeled through institutions of higher education?
Yeah, I think ideally, right? Ideally, one of the things too, I think is important for institutions to think about is, we have particular learning and development outcomes that we want our students to gain, or, really come out having acquired a skill when they graduate from our institutions. And I think those need to be really rethought to be, because oftentimes they're more about the marketplace, they're more about the job, they're more about, this idea of being a global citizen. And I always ask, global citizen of what, right? Most Native students are citizens of their own nation. Are you talking about that? Or, and so I think really thinking about rethinking our learning and development outcomes as institutions. And so then I think, that will really hopefully move forward curriculum, practices, policy, orientation programs to really be centered in what those learning and development outcomes are. But I think my hope is that, particularly non-Native folks, can really gain some insight about issues that we as Native people, and that, my non-Native friends are the biggest advocates, and I appreciate that, right? They don't require me to do the work, they do the work with me. And I think that's super important, is to have non-Native advocates, particularly around Native issues, so that something else, I was getting a lot of, that's awful, that's messed up. Yeah, but how can we create a narrative that nobody would ever think of not including us on a national, including our identity nationally, and forgetting us like they did. So I think ideally it would, and hopefully that's my hope anyways.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any questions from anybody else? Okay, if so, just cut me off. Otherwise, I'm just going to wrap things up here first by thanking you, Dr. Jennings, for taking the time out of your day to join us. It was a very insightful presentation and honestly very unique with your use of the, I think, what was it, the Metameter, or the website that you use. So that was actually really fun and interactive. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this topic and for giving us inspiration, ideas, and how we can help decolonize and make our institution a more comfortable place for Native students. Also a special thank you to Michael and Annika for asking some really great questions as well, and really helping keep this into a dialogue. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and that will conclude the Blugold Dialogue for November.